So good morning, my name's Ciara Kelly. I'm a specialist registrar in public health. I'm a public health doctor. I worked with the Department of Public Health in Galway from 2019 to 2021, and during that time I did this study with colleagues Emmett, Michal Dermot and Anya McNamara, who's the Area Director for Public Health West and Midwest. So I'm going to tell you about it this morning. I have the grand honour of getting you to your coffee break, so don't worry, we'll get you there. And our study really was about investigating adolescent binge drinking in the west of Ireland using the Planet Youth 2020 survey. So I'm going to give you an overview of that over the next kind of 20 minutes or so, highlighting our key findings and the implications of the work. So just by way of background, as the Minister Naughton said earlier, I don't think I need to convince this room that alcohol is a global public health issue. It's a leading cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide. The World Health Organization has deemed it to be a causal factor in a wide range of disease and injury conditions, many of which I'm sure we're familiar with, things like liver disease, cardiovascular disease, a range of different cancers and other impacts like violence and road traffic accidents. And so it has a range of health and non-health sector impacts. And we know that the volume of alcohol consumption and the pattern of consumption are really the key factors in determining those harms due to alcohol. And if we look at, I suppose, the scorecard in Ireland in terms of volume and pattern of consumption, we know that in 2022, our per capita consumption was 10.2 litres, which is above the target that our current alcohol legislation, the Public Health Alcohol Act, set for 2020 of 9 litres, about 9.1. And looking at the Healthy Ireland survey from 2022, we can see that the respondents who are age 15 plus, it's a representative sample of the population. I'm sure many in the room are familiar with it, but about 67% of those said that they had consumed alcohol in the past 6 months, so a majority. And looking at the youngest age group of that was the 15 to 24-year-olds, we can see that was about 78% among males and 74% among females. So it's actually a reversal in terms of the gender prevalence from 2021. And in terms of the pattern of consumption, just about a third of drinkers are considered binge drinkers, and that's using a definition of consuming 6 or more standard drinks in a single drinking occasion. And Healthy Ireland reported on this and extrapolated that to essentially mean that about a fifth of our population, age 15 plus, will be considered binge drinkers, and that's high. And if we look at the figures on that from Healthy Ireland, we can see it's much higher in terms of binge drinking among men compared to women in the 15 to 24-year-old age group particularly, which I'm focusing on because our study really was about adolescents. And overall, I suppose that really feeds into this whole culture that we have, which really in large parts normalises excessive and harmful patterns of alcohol consumption. And we know from previous Healthy Ireland surveys as well that we have quite limited awareness about the harms associated with alcohol use. And we're quite good at knowing about the harms to do with our liver, for example, but less so about the different cancers that are associated with alcohol as a risk factor. And if we look then at adolescents, just to bring us to kind of more of a focus of the population of our study, we know that this is a period of life when alcohol use typically begins. The WHO defines adolescence as being between 10 and 19. And this age group, as we all know, is a period of major developmental transitions in many different ways. And this group are, as a result, a lot more vulnerable to the harms due to alcohol compared to adults. And there's a risk also that there's, that harmful patterns of alcohol consumption can emerge in this age group and become established into later life. And you'll forgive me for mentioning a couple of other surveys on adolescent health when we're at a Planet Youth conference, but just to give you some context, Emmett mentioned the HBSC data, and we know from 2018 that the majority of those say they've had their first drink by the age of 17. Also from HBSC in 2018, we know 62% of 17-year-olds say that they've ever been really drunk. Emmett showed you some of the data on past drunkenness from the Planet Youth data, and as he showed in his presentation, about a quarter to a third of 15 to 16-year-olds in the 2022 survey said they'd been drunk in the past month, which is high. And ESPAD, the European School Survey Project on Alcohol and Drugs, found in 2019 that about a third of adolescents aged 15 to 16 said they had binge drank in the past 30 days, and that was consuming 5 or more drinks, which is a lot of alcohol. And I suppose then the question is what's driving this, and the literature has looked at different factors that are associated with binge drinking, and that's what we did in our study to look at the Irish context. So I'll go on now to just show you a couple of trends in sort of adolescent alcohol consumption before we get on to our study specifically. So just to show you, and I thought it was interesting to look at these trends. This is based on HPSC data, and this is pre-obviously Planet Youth coming in, but I just want to show you sort of the direction. So you can see on the left-hand side, you've got 1998 to 2018, so that's the waves of HPSC data. So that's 10 years obviously prior to Planet Youth coming in. But you can see the trends going up. So 13 to 17, you can see the report of lifetime alcohol consumption is increasing as you go up through adolescence. The good news is that you can see, hopefully it might be a little bit small, but what you can see in the figures going down vertically is that the report of lifetime alcohol consumption is decreasing within each age group as you go from past to present. So that's the good news. But if you look at the bottom from 2018, you can see this big jumps there as you go from 13 up to 17. And we see that as well when we look at lifetime drunkenness too. And we're seeing those figures in the past month drunkenness that Planet Youth has found in surveys in the last kind of 4 or 5 years. And then just looking at binge drinking specifically, this data is from the SBAD trends. So you can see a nice green line that's going down from 1995 down to 2015, and that's a decreasing trend in binge drinking, or what they call heavy episodic drinking. The terms are kind of used interchangeably. But you can see from 2015 to 2019, we had an increase. So a 28% 30-day prevalence of binge drinking, that increased up to about a third in 2019. So we'll be looking at the next trend there. So now to get on to our study, why did we do it? So the rationale really is that if we know about the factors that influence alcohol use among adolescents, we can target, as Emma said, our interventions to protect this group from alcohol-related harm specifically was the focus of our study. We looked at binge drinking particularly because it is, as you've seen, quite a prevalent and it is a harmful pattern of alcohol consumption. And there's a lot of literature internationally that's looked at binge drinking in other developed countries and the risk and protective factors around it. But what we found doing a literature review on this is that there's quite limited data in the Irish context. So our aim was to examine both the prevalence of and potential risk and protective factors associated with binge drinking among 15 to 16-year-olds in the west of Ireland using the Planet Youth 2020 survey. So I won't go into the background sort of on Planet Youth itself, because Emma's done that very helpfully for me. But our study was a cross-sectional study, so a snapshot style study, and it was a secondary analysis of the 2020 survey dataset. As you've heard, the data is collected through the Planet Youth questionnaire. We didn't need new ethical approval for the study because we didn't collect any new data as part of it. And our population was from the Planet Youth survey, 15 to 16-year-olds in secondary schools and youth reach centres across Galway, Mayo and Roscommon. It's over 6,300. So all in the 2020 survey were invited to participate, all opted to, and we got a response rate then of about 80%, adjusted down to about 79%, so about 5,000 valid surveys. And when we only included those aged 15 to 16, that was just over 4,400. So then in terms of our variables for our study, so our outcome was binge drinking. And how we define this, I suppose it's important to say by way of context that there is some variation in the literature on how binge drinking is defined. Broadly speaking, I'm sure we'd all understand it to be consuming a large quantity of alcohol in a short space of time. That's sort of the intuitive understanding, I think, in the general population. But there is some variation in different countries and public health organisations. In the Planet Youth Survey 2020, participants were asked to respond for the number of times they'd consumed 5 or more drinks in a 2-hour period or less. And when we looked at the literature, there was a fair bit of variation, but the most consistent number in terms of the number of drinks was 5. So we chose that just to be able to contextualise it a bit. And we categorised it as ever having binge drank before or never. And then what were our sort of potential risk and protective factors that we looked at in our study? So as I said, we did a literature review to look at this and look at international data on this as well. And we also looked at, as you've already seen, the Planet Youth model and looking at the different domains within the social environment of adolescents. So parents and family, peer group, school, leisure time and local community, and then individual factors. And what we found from our literature review is that the kind of most common factors we were seeing largely aligned to those domains. And so what we looked at in terms of our independent variables or our exposure variables largely mapped to those. So under socio-demographic factors, we had gender, ethnicity and maternal education as sort of a proxy of socioeconomic status. Under other individual factors, we had self-rated mental health, current cigarette use and current cannabis use reflecting past 30-day use. The parental factors, obviously this was a big focus and Emmett's touched on it nicely in his own presentation. So just to say, we did look at that parental supervision piece, which was a combined variable based on responses to adolescents saying that their parents knew who they were with in the evening and where they were. And that was based on work that the Icelandic group had done as well. We looked at parental drunkenness as reported by adolescents in a typical week, parental reaction to adolescents becoming drunk and getting alcohol from parents. Our one peer factor was having friends who drank alcohol. That's a very strong risk factor in the literature. Our school factor was that school engagement score. So this again was one of those combined variables, and it was combined from responses to 4 statements that adolescents gave. So it was about preparation for classes, putting effort into schoolwork, finding schoolwork pointless and boring. So essentially a higher score meant you're more engaged with your schoolwork. And our leisure factor then was team and club sport participation. And then finally, in the local community, we kind of focused down on where adolescents get alcohol from apart from their parents. So we looked at supply from friends and from another non-parent adult. So our analysis, just very briefly on this, so we initially did kind of descriptive statistics looking at the prevalence of binge drinking and the characteristics of our population for our study, and then did a logistic regression. So we looked at each independent variable and our outcome on its own to give us an unadjusted odds ratio as our effect measure, and then we then did a multivariable logistic regression. So we did what's called a complete case analysis. That meant that we excluded those who had missing data for the outcome or the exposure variables. And for our regression, without going into too much detail, we basically added each group of variables to the model as we went through. So our final model had all of our variables included and adjusted for. So that gave us an adjusted odds ratio. I'll just show you that very quickly, just easier to see, I think. So our first model started off with the socio-demographic variables. Model 2 added the individual factors. Model 3, the parents and family factors, which were largely parental factors, really. Model 4 added peer group. Model 5, school. And then Model 6 added our last 3 variables, and so had everything included within it. Now, just to get into the meat of our results. So firstly, looking at the prevalence of ever binge drinking, we found, and I know this might be a little bit small in terms of the numbers, but we found over 1/3 of adolescents said they had ever binge drank in the past, so they'd ever consumed 5 or more drinks in that 2-hour period or less. And hopefully some of you may be towards the front, but you can see it's slightly higher among males compared to females. So about 36% for males said they had in the past, and nearly 33% for females. And a question we've been asked quite a lot since publishing this study is, that's fine, but that's ever versus never. So how many times have adolescents actually binge drank in the past? So when we looked at this, you can see the 0 times is about 2/3, which is what we'd expect because 1/3 of them have. And then we can see that about 76% said they binge drank anywhere between 1 and 9 times in the past. And the rest, which is about 22%, had done so 10 plus times. So a bit of a range there, but most of them doing it kind of between 1 and 5 times before. And then just to give you an idea of our study population, so you can see we had a relatively even split in terms of gender, predominantly, sample was predominantly of white ethnicity. Looking at mental health, just, I know I haven't that highlighted, but just to say about 1/5 reported bad or very bad mental health, so just important to note that. And the majority weren't current cigarette users or current cannabis users, as you can see there. Looking at the parental factors, just to highlight, almost 16% said their parents became drunk at least once a week. Almost 40% said their parents would be a bit against it or they wouldn't care if they became drunk. And about nearly 1/5 said they sometimes, often, or almost always get alcohol from parents, which relates back to the points Emma was making in his presentation. And then finally, also of concern really is that in vast majority said they have friends that drink alcohol. In terms of the kind of just some key things to point out here, you can see just over half said they participate in team or club sports once or more per week. About 1/3 said they sometimes, often, or almost always get alcohol from their friends, and about 1/5 said they do that from another non-parent adult. In the interest of time, I'm just going to show you the results from our final model results of our logistic regression. So we found 2 protective factors across our socio-demographic variables. So female gender and non-white ethnicity were each associated with roughly half the odds of ever binge drinking compared to male gender and white ethnicity, which were the reference groups. Sorry, you can just see there, just to say maternal education wasn't significantly associated with binge drinking in our final model. Looking at the individual factors, we can see reporting bad or very bad mental health was associated with about 1.6 times higher odds of ever binge drinking compared to good or very good mental health. And current cigarette use and current cannabis use were respectively associated with 4 and almost 3 times higher odds of ever binge drinking compared to not. Looking at the parental factors, so we found 2 protective parental factors. So firstly, the parental supervision finding. So the parental supervision variable was one of 2 what we call scale variables, so that had a score, whereas the others were categories. So the way I'd explain this is basically as the parental supervision score increased by a standard deviation, the odds of ever binge drinking went down. So it was protective to have higher parental supervision in terms of binge drinking. You can see our variable around parental drunkenness, it wasn't significantly associated with ever binge drinking in our final model. It was when we looked at this variable on its own, but it's just a point to note really, and I'll speak a bit more on that in kind of discussing the findings. Our second protective factor was that parental reaction to adolescent drunkenness. So those who said their parents would be totally against their becoming drunk had about half the odds of ever binge drinking compared to those who said their parents would be a bit against it or wouldn't care. So sort of a difference in attitudes there, and that was a significant factor. And finally, another important point to note that those who said they do get alcohol from their parents, sometimes, often, almost always, had about 1.8 times higher odds of ever binge drinking compared to those who never or rarely did that. Then looking at the peer group, so this wasn't really a surprising finding because this is so commonly seen in the literature, but you can see the strength of the effect there. So those who had friends that drink alcohol were almost 5 times more likely had 5 times higher odds of ever binge drinking compared to those who didn't. And also a surprising finding really was around school engagement. So each 1 standard deviation increase in the school engagement score corresponded to a small but significant increased odds of ever binge drinking, and I'll speak more on that in a couple of slides. Finally, looking at the team and club sports participation, you can see here that participating in team or club sports was actually associated with increased odds of ever binge drinking. And again, I'll elaborate a bit more on that and possible reasons in a later slide. But you can see the odds ratio went up with increasing weekly participation. So that was of note to see. And finally, getting alcohol from friends or from another non-parent adult was associated with about 6 and about 4 times higher odds of ever binge drinking compared to never or rarely doing that. that's a lot of data to take in one go, so I'm going to recap on those findings for you and try and contextualise them a bit. So firstly, our prevalence of ever binge drinking. So we found that over a third of participants, 15 to 16-year-olds in the Planet Youth West 2020 survey reported ever binge drinking in the past. As I said, there is challenges making direct comparisons with this, between our finding and others. And in the interest of time, I'll just highlight two. When we looked at the Planet Youth Survey 2018, there was a slight difference in how this question was asked. So it was 1 hour period or less. We had a 2 hour period or less. That's it's a relatively minor difference in the context of, I suppose, the whole premise around binge drinking being a lot of alcohol in a short space of time. What we can see here is just under 1/3 of adolescents in 2018 said they had ever drank 5 or more drinks in 1 hour or less. So although there's a little bit of a difference in definition there, it does suggest a possible increasing prevalence of adolescent binge drinking in the West using the Planet Youth West data. So we need to look at that in 2022 context as well. And looking at SPAD in 2019, as I said in an earlier slide, about a third of those from Ireland who participated said that they had binge drank in the past 30 days or engaged in heavy episodic drinking, as the other terminology is. So there's some similarities there too, but again, slight difference in definition, that's past 30 day. But either way, these figures are, they're not good numbers, so it's important to note them all in context. Just to recap on our risk and protective factors. So we found 4 protective factors. So we found, in terms of the socio-demographic factors, our female gender finding, it wasn't that surprising really, or wasn't surprising to find, I suppose, because we know substance use is generally more common among males compared to females, and we saw a higher prevalence in ever binge drinking among males in our study. Our finding around ethnicity, we didn't do a literature review on this specifically, of course, so I'm definitely not best informed to speak to that in detail, but a couple of the studies that we found really noted this as an understudied area and one that needs more of a look. And possible differences, reasons for differences could have been around differences in culture around alcohol, or possibly greater influence of family versus peers. Our 2 parental factors, they are both very consistent with international literature that we found in our review in terms of them being protective against adolescent alcohol misuse in research from developed countries. We found 9 risk factors, so I'll just briefly touch on those again. So we found bad or very bad mental health and current cigarette and cannabis use were all associated with increased odds of ever binge drinking. That does support existing similar sort of study designs that we found in our literature review, but the kind of caveat here is that with all cross-sectional studies, they are a snapshot study, so you can't say for definite about the temporality of the relationship between the two things, so which is the chicken and which is the egg. I suppose, so what we need really in the Irish context is longitudinal studies, so long follow-up studies on these factors to try and tease out those relationships a bit more, because they can definitely influence each other. The finding around getting alcohol from parents is really important, and that's consistent with international literature, and so it's good to see our studies support that in the Irish context. And finally, having friends that drink alcohol, that's a very strong and consistent risk factor in the literature, and speaks to what I'm sure we're all familiar with, the idea of friends being such a strong influence in adolescence, so our findings supported that. And then just our last couple of risk factors here. So our school engagement finding was unexpected. In our literature review, we found that those who have higher academic achievement, that would tend to be a protective factor for binge drinking, whereas missing school or school truancy is identified as a risk factor for binge drinking. So it's hard to, say for definite, the exact reason for our finding. Possible reasons could be that those that are more engaged with school might also have other influences that influence a risk of binge drinking, like peer interaction. It could be something we didn't measure in our study, so it's a point of note, and I think it definitely warrants further look in future. Similarly, our finding around team and club sports, that definitely warrants further exploration as well, and I'll speak on that in my last slide on public health implications. And then getting alcohol from friends and from another non-parent adult, there wasn't a lot of literature on this that we found in our review, but it does support the small number of existing studies that we did find that looked at these factors particularly. And I suppose the finding around friends, it shouldn't be that surprising given the strength of the peer influence that we see. Just 2 other findings of note. So we didn't find a significant association between maternal education and adolescent binge drinking. And this seems to be a common theme in the literature. A 2016 systematic review looked at this relationship, particularly between socioeconomic status and binge drinking, and found inconsistencies as to whether it's a risk factor or protective factor or not associated at all. And they hypothesised that was due to a lot of differences in how it's defined in the literature. So more work needed there. And then finally of note, we didn't find a significant association in our final model between parental drunkenness and adolescent binge drinking. In the literature, that has been seen to be a risk factor, so I suppose it's possible we didn't have enough numbers to detect it, although we had a decent study sample size. It could be how it was defined in our study, or it may be that there's a greater influence of peers compared to parents in this regard in our study, but I'm sure people in the room might have thoughts, and happy to chat on that in the coffee break. Just to briefly touch on our strengths and limitations, my last few slides. So this is a large study population, which is one of the great things about the Planet Youth survey. Over 4,400 adolescents in the west of Ireland, really high response rates. That gives us a lot of confidence about the representativeness of the sample. It includes urban and rural populations, which is great in terms of thinking about generalisability. And as I mentioned at the start, this does address a really important public health issue and what was a relative gap in the Irish context in terms of risk and protective factors for binge drinking. Limitations, I mentioned those in terms of our study design, so you can't say for definite, what is coming first before the other in a cross-sectional study, but it does add to a body of literature and other study designs that are out there. There's always the potential for bias in studies like ours, observational research, particularly, for example, around responding to questionnaires and self-report and recall bias. Their potentials inherent in collecting data through questionnaires, but also it's a rich source of data at the same time. We did exclude participants with missing data to do what's called a complete case analysis, so that has to be borne in mind when we're thinking about our findings, and we've spoken on that in our published paper. And then I guess each country will have its own kind of socio-cultural context around alcohol, so that can limit a little bit, I guess, our generalisability to other countries. This was also a survey, as Emmett said, that was done during the COVID-19 pandemic, so that's important background context too. But we did see a lot of consistency in our findings with the international literature on this topic, which is good. There's always the potential, finally, for residual confounding, so other factors that we didn't measure that are potentially explaining some of the associations that we found. So that's just a last point to note. So my last slide, so what does this all mean? The so what of it is really the public health implications. So there's three main ones that I see, and I'd happy to chat to anyone in the next break on their thoughts too. So there's been a huge amount of work, as Emma's laid out, and as I've learned through doing this study and speaking to colleagues in the HSC alcohol programme around informing adolescents, their parents and carers about the harms associated with alcohol use. And I think our study, which is based on relatively recent data, underscores the need to continue that great work and to build on it and to keep building this evidence base around it. We know, as I said, there is limited awareness among the Irish population about harms associated with alcohol, some more than others. I think we need to continue that tailored and kind of multimodal messaging to reach adolescents. And particularly our study found a really strong influence of parents. There was 2 protective factors and 1 risk factor. And I think that's a good piece of evidence that we can bring to this messaging that we're sharing with parents. I think also our study highlights the need to protect adolescents from this preventable burden of harm due to alcohol. There's a wide range of acute and potentially long-term harms that I spoke about at the start of the presentation, and I'm sure many in the room are aware of. And I think in the same train of thought, this really underscores the need for all of our support for the continued implementation of our Public Health Alcohol Act, which is under implementation at present, and it has as one of its core objectives the need to delay initiation of underage alcohol use. And I think the study and our study in contact with others definitely supports the need for that to get full implementation so all objectives can be achieved. And then finally, every study will always identify a need for further study, which is the beauty of research, but I think there's great value in these trends over time that we're seeing in Planet Youth. The Planet Youth surveys are brilliant for that, and we're seeing that in real time now, and the speed of the data coming out is brilliant. So it's great that we can keep a close eye on this area among others. The finding that we had around sports participation and adolescent alcohol use, I think, is certainly an area that we would call out from this study as needing further work. There's a lot of potential different explanations as to why we found what we did. We didn't have a sports-specific breakdown, so we can't comment on that. It could be that there is, a lot more peer interaction as a result of participating in team or club sports, and we know peer influence is very strong around alcohol. It could be there's more opportunities for socialisation by participating in different teams and events and things like that. It's really hard to say, and we can't say for definite on the basis of our study, and I'm sure people in the room have thoughts as well. But I think it's an area where we need more quantitative research, but also qualitative research to try and understand that better and think about it in more detail. And then finally, I suppose I think it'd be really valuable to just have more data on the sort of peer and cultural norms about alcohol use among adolescents, given how much we know about the strength of the influence of peers, and try and understand what is driving that and try and change it then at its heart. So just want to finish off by saying a sincere thank you to my co-authors, to the Western Region Drug and Alcohol Task Force and Planet Youth West team within it for all their fantastic work on Planet Youth, and I was delighted to get the chance to use this data. Also to colleagues in the HC Alcohol programme who we spoke with in designing this study and since then, and also today's conference team for the chance to speak today. And there's our references in case you want them. Thanks very much.